Breaking down the early running back profiles, or are we drafting Saquon Barkley this year? That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we're getting close to the summer here. It's late May. We've been talking about a lot of different topics. Our conversations, our pre-show conversations are starting to ramp up. We've been talking about maybe starting our redraft drafting season here soon enough. We'll see, what we decide with that. But today's pre-show conversation kind of meandered through a few different things. We're talking about kick returners for a while. Thanks. Shout out to the Fantasy Cares Eliminators tournaments that have kick return yardage. I've been drafting some best ball teams in those contests, and I was telling you all about my kick return research. But we started talking about Saquon Barkley a little bit, and he's like, it's like the Saquon Barkley problem. He's the guy that we need to discuss. We weren't really in on him last year. He was exceptional. There were a lot of fantasy analysts that weren't really in on him during the season last year. I was just looking over some of my notes towards the end of the season from Stealing Signals, and I kind of referenced this, but I remember during the season, there was a lot of people that are, I don't know what you call it. Definitely players in fantasy, but maybe aren't content creators. There's like the pros versus Joes tournaments, and they maybe would be the Joes in some of those tournaments or what have you. Fans, I don't know what you call them, but they were on social media and other places, and certainly the opinion that they wanted to make heard, or the thing that I saw voiced a decent amount around Saquon Barkley was how, like, the little guy was right this year and the fantasy analyst was wrong. Sort of that sort of vibe, which there were a lot of people that in the fantasy space were out on Barkley. That's not everyone. There were several that were in on him as well, but his ADP
but as you make that note, I do want to point out that sort of a lot of these folks are not the little guy, and that they have more experience playing fantasy football than anyone. And then B, it's also fascinating to me that coming off of this season in early FFPC drafting, Saquon Barkley is not the number one running back. Bijan Robinson is. Now it's very, very close, but that part I thought was surprising, given
that is very surprising
what we got from Saquon last year.
That is very surprising. Over on Underdog, we have Barkley a little bit ahead of Bijan. His ADP is 2.5. Bijan's 4.0. Now, difference in scoring system. FFPC's PPR. Bijan Robinson caught a lot of balls last year. Saquon Barkley did not. Over on Underdog, you're talking half PPR. Could be a viable reason for the flip, and maybe correct in that regard. But yeah, regardless of the whole backstory on Saquon Barkley's 2024, he ran for 2,000 yards. He was completely unstoppable. He went to the postseason and had 200 yards and 2 TDs against the Rams in the second round, and then 100 plus and 3 TDs against the Commanders in the third round. Got stopped a little bit in the rushing game in the Super Bowl, but also caught 6 passes in that game. Showed that there was the potential for him to really be used a little bit more in the receiving game. His season high in the regular season was 4 catches, and had more games at 2 or fewer than anything. Just a couple games with 3 or more catches. It looks like 4 all season. Multiple games with no catches, but a scoring profile was really unique. I was just talking to you. I went back and looked at readers of Stealing Signals will know that I was writing about him every week and kind of going through it throughout the season. And towards the end of the year, after the Carolina game in week 14, I talked about how that was the game for me that was why I bought into drafting him in the top 5 in 2025. And I wanted to kind of put it all in writing so that I didn't change my mind in the offseason. And yet, Shawn, our pre-show discussion started with me telling you how many touches he had through the Super Bowl. He wound up with 482 touches. We used to talk about the curse of 370 like 20 years ago. I say I wasn't a part of the fantasy space then, but it was a fantasy discussion point 20 years ago when I was in high school or in college. And 370 referred to specifically rush attempts, not just touches. And if you include his playoff run for Saquon Barkley, he had about 430, I think it was, over 430 rush attempts. So I think it was 436, 66 rush attempts clear of that 370 rush attempt figure. At the same time, how many of those rush attempts were him just running a long ways to the end zone and not being touched? I mean, so there's all of these discussions. The running backs were a lot healthier last year. We know that defenses have gotten lighter. There's been discussion about defenses not practicing run stopping techniques as much. We know that like nickel formations are up defensively, so you're putting more defensive backs on the field. So running backs having a tremendous 2024 across the board was probably both, some variance on the health side, but also a product of macro trends that have favored running backs where defenses are not prioritizing stopping the run anymore. And you could also talk about, okay, well, a guy like Saquon Barkley has all this crazy number of touches, but how many was he really getting hit by, some of those back 20 years ago? We're talking about those stats. Tony Siragusa's out there. Sam Adams is out there. These 350-pound defensive tackles are landing on top of these running backs on half of their carries up the middle. That's not happening in the 2025 NFL. There's so many intriguing elements to Saquon. He's this example of a player that maybe from a profile perspective shouldn't hit. When I was referencing that Carolina game late in the year, and for me, why it was the reason that I was ready to buy in on him, it's because he didn't catch a single pass in that game. He didn't score a touchdown, and his long run was only 18 yards. He didn't have a 20-yard run. So those are the things that are easy ways to rack up chunk points, right? That high value touches I look at as receptions and goal line work. You get the TDs, you get the catches, free PPR points, and then obviously long runs. You can just rack up a ton of points on a 40, 50-yard run, a bunch of yardage. Didn't have that either, and yet he had 124 rushing yards in that game because of how much push the Eagles offensive line could get for him and how dynamic he was. In addition to that, it was this combination we talked about all last year, before contact, after contact. He had it all. For a guy who's what I would like to call with the high value touches a trap back, he looks kind of like a trap back from a profile perspective, to still have a floor of 124 rushing yards, 12.4 points, while adding nothing else of the other like fun exotic variety, a touchdown or a catch or anything. That's a really good floor if that's your floor. And then you have the potential to do all these other things and have these ceilings. But I was arguing that the scoring range for him was so different than other trap backs, quote unquote, guys that profile like him. So he is so unique to me in so many ways. His profile shouldn't have the type of scoring range that it does. I mean, I remember years ago when I was talking about the trap back at the beginning, I remember Damian Harris. I don't mean to pick on the guy, but early in one year, he had a game like 60 rush yards and 2 TDs. And I was like, to get to 18 points, my point was, when you're not catching any passes because he had no catches in PPR, you have to have multi-touchdowns, basically. So that the point was, the floor is 60 yards. It's 6 points. And the ceiling, if you get multiple TDs, you might have to have a 3-touchdown game, et cetera. But Barkley's doing that so frequently, these multiple TD games, the rush yard games where he's up over 150. He is chipping in some receiving. A different range. The whole point, the whole issue with trap backs was that the range is like 6 to 18 or something. But for Barkley, it's not. I mean, he's going to run for 100 yards or have 100 total yards, etc. So anyway, I love to do this to you, Sean. We're 8 minutes in, and I don't even think I've heard from you. But Saquon Barkley is a fascinating player for this year, coming off massive number of touches, one of the most incredible running back seasons we've ever seen. He's also going to be – he just turned 28 in February. So this is his age 28 season. He's had leg issues in the past. He's had lower leg problems. There's a lot of things we can talk about with respect to that. Obviously, picture of health last year, but I was talking to you, a little bit concerning for me that he played all the way through February. You look at Christian McCaffrey, has a whole injury plague 2024. Probably relevant that he played into the Super Bowl in 2023, or at least it's maybe relevant to me that his season went all the way into February. I was just referencing to you, Jason Tatum just had an Achilles tear. And I saw a stat that he had played more minutes between regular seasons and postseasons than almost any other NBA player in the last 3 or 4 years or something. And the Celtics had played all the way to the NBA Finals the year prior. And how difficult it is when you don't have an offseason to rehab because you've played so much longer into the postseason. How does that impact things? We know it impacts things like the Super Bowl hangover and stuff like that for some of these teams that go all the way to the Super Bowl, they lose. You got a short offseason to come around and be competitive the next year, and it seems to impact more than we probably talk about. Is that an issue for Barkley? This is the most fascinating player for 2025, bar none.
He is, because of that combination of elements you talked about, where it was controversial going into the season, where, I mean, one of the things that is so interesting and fun about it is that he had been such an extraordinary rookie and was considered to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, running back prospect of all time. And then after that season, his career gets wiped out by a combination of injuries and playing for the New York Giants. And so you get this team change, and suddenly it's back to the situation where this guy looks otherworldly. And the reason that it stands out so much is the sheer number of highlight plays is, more or less unlike anything that we've seen in a long time. And I think there's so many different ways to look at this, but for me, they do in many ways dovetail with this idea of explosiveness and this idea of efficiency. And what do we do, not just with Barkley, but with other players in the running back universe currently, with what you did in terms of setting the stage for us on how defenses are playing the running back position right now and what that might mean. So the variety of ways that we can look at it, I'm going to throw a handful of things at you and see, kind of what sticks as maybe the most interesting. But Ben, I do think this is fun because a lot of the guys that hit in these boxes that I'm about to talk about are not necessarily players that we would have consistently targeted in the past. And yet in some ways they're exactly the type of player. So we think about last season, and the thing that really jumps out is it's not just Barkley, right? When we break down the scoring into expected points and fantasy points over expected, and you could talk about some of the, tiny little details of that, how it might be misleading, but generally it gives us this picture of what a running back is doing in terms of workload, and then what their talent is doing on top of it, talent and or luck, right? But when we look at a season here where Derrick Henry averages 6 fantasy points over expected per game, where Barkley is at 5.8, Jahmyr Gibbs is at 5.8. You can even throw in someone like a James Cook at 4.2. But we're definitely looking at Henry, Barkley, and Gibbs in this category that is pretty unique, right? And then we jump back to price. And in early Big Gorilla and main event drafts, we have Barkley at the 103. We have Henry at the 204. We have Gibbs still obviously there in the first round at the 106. The other player, or the other maybe 2 players that I would throw into this, even though everybody basically through Jonathan Taylor more or less fits into this category, but you have Taylor and you have Devon Achane for reasons I'm going to mention in a moment. Now, we know that we have the FPUE numbers that stand out, but it does come back basically, not surprisingly, to these big plays. And you can look at that from a variety of different perspectives. You mentioned the current landscape for defense. SIS allows you to pull up the number of defenders in the box. We have a huge number of carries for all of these guys with essentially 7 or fewer. Once you get to 8, once you get to 9, then you're talking about heavier boxes here. But just to take a fairly large sample, and you can break it down to other formations if you want, but with 7 or fewer, Saquon Barkley averaged 6.7 yards per carry. He averaged 3.7 yards before contact. Jahmyr Gibbs was over 6 and again averaged over 3 yards before contact. Derrick Henry was at 5.7, 2.7 yards before contact. All 3 of those guys averaged exactly 3 yards after contact. When they're having to face fewer guys, or they're having to face defenders in the secondary who maybe are getting a hand on them, but not in a way that's going to stop them. We're talking about extremely efficient numbers here. And not surprisingly, when you go in and look at the next gen stats, for example, to see how fast these players are, you have Jahmyr Gibbs with a 22 mile per hour run in a game. You have Barkley with 2 just under 22. You got James Cook on that board. You have multiple other carries from Gibbs and Barkley. You have multiple carries from Derrick Henry, and you have multiple carries from Jonathan Taylor. One of the things that I thought was so interesting about this Saquon Barkley season is that it's not exactly the same, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of Jonathan Taylor's 2021, where he scores 22 points a game, almost the exact same scoring level. He does catch a few more balls. But one of the things you can do with the RotoViz screener is go in and see, who's created these explosive plays in the past, who's generating long runs, who's having them go into the end zone. You can do the deal where you look at just the efficiency numbers. And so then when we're thinking about someone like a Derrick Henry, who's in the second round, when we're thinking about how it might relate to a Jahmyr Gibbs in the middle of the first round, still a very expensive pick, but one that is cheaper than Barkley. And in some ways, one that's even more controversial because we don't know what the workload is going to be. With Barkley, he's probably going to get the vast majority of the touches. We did get like this one impressive drive in garbage time from Will Shipley, but it's going to be Saquon Barkley, right? You look at the EP, or you look at the FPOE numbers for someone like a Derrick Henry, and he's unique in being able to do that year after year after year. I'm not saying that we shouldn't regress it a tiny bit, but when you take someone with Derrick Henry's profile, the ability to break the big plays consistently, you run into some danger when you're doing that. So I also have pulled up the long runs and the touchdown runs numbers. We have Chris Johnson here. In 2009, Ben, he had 17 carries of 25 yards or more, 8 of which went into the end zone. He came back and the next year had 10 of those with 3 getting into the end zone. He came back the year after that with 7 and 1 getting into the end zone. Obviously, you're having those numbers decrease, and yet at the top of the leaderboard, you have multiple seasons from Adrian Peterson, who is really the one guy from history, along with, say, Chris Johnson, who consistently had these types of seasons. The interesting thing here is that 2018 rookie season from Barkley actually had more 25-plus carries than he did a year ago. I'm doing this through week 17 in order to do apples and apples. I'm not sure how many massive carries Barkley had in 18, although I don't think he played in 18. You work through the different profiles of these players, and while we know that it's difficult to break the long runs, and we know that the touchdowns can bounce around, what you're tending to see is a lot of risk in fading the most explosive guys. And so when we think about what a profile really is and how much is baked in, you discussed Barkley within the context of what you feel like his floor is. One of the things that I think is especially important when you're thinking either in terms of long runs or just, the total amount of efficiency. Again, these 7 or fewer guys in the box. I mean, Barkley had 222 carries in that category last year. Gibbs had 183, right? The efficiency level on those carries is so extraordinarily high that I think we have to respect, and certainly for me, the thing that I've always done is almost exclusively draft blazing fast running backs. And certainly if you're not having that priced in, we talk about dead zone backs. I mean, some listeners don't want to hear us talk about dead zone out into the future like we've heard about it enough. But one of the things about a dead zone back is you're very rarely drafting someone who runs a 4.35 or in games puts up 21 plus mile per hour carries and is going to beat you because of their talent. The thing that's so much fun about where we are now in the NFL with running backs is that defenses have chosen to play an approach that allows the superstars to play up as superstars. And then you can even go to the next level that I'm talking about particular offenses, because one of the other things we're looking at with these offenses is that, you have a pick your poison element to playing the Eagles, the Ravens, the Lions. There are going to be some other teams like that. The thing that really sort of stands out with Jonathan Taylor versus these guys is just how ineffective the Colts offense is. How do you think that's going to potentially change in the future? One of the things, Ben, that was kind of interesting, Jonathan Taylor had more of these long runs actually last year than he did in his 2021 season, or I believe it was the identical number. He had that breakout at the end. If you have better QB play from the Colts, what Taylor could be. So as we dive into a little bit more, I do think it's fun that it becomes not just a Saquon Barkley conversation, but an entire first 2 rounds conversation of how do you handle these guys versus each other, and then how do you handle them versus the receivers.
And yeah, Saquon obviously the poster boy for a lot of this, but completely agree. And I'm looking at an article that I wrote on January 4th that I hardly remembered and had to review, but I titled it "How Do We Approach Running Backs in 2025?" The subtitle was, running back scored, draft structures are key, fantasies evolving, and was, I started it by saying undoubtedly the question I've been asked the most during the 2024 season had as the 2024 season had wound down, and we started to transition into 2025 thinking with some version of what was the deal with running back scoring, or this form of, are we going to be drafting running backs high in 2025? This whole idea of, zero RB and all of these types of things. And I think everything that you're discussing and everything that we're trying to discuss here is the really important thing to understand is how the NFL is evolving and how different running back profiles are now going to be more desirable even from a probabilistic or range of outcomes based thought process. And even for somebody who they may not have been desirable for in the past, right? Because I don't want to discount people who have always liked to draft running backs high or something, to that effect. But it's for you and I, particularly, Sean, there's so much here. So in this piece, I shared some numbers from The Athletic, from 10 to Win, from The Athletic, where we're talking about the smaller edge defenders and linebackers. He talked to an NFL front office member who added that they thought that not only had linebackers gotten smaller, but overall that linebacker play had gotten worse. There was some discussion in his piece about less emphasis on developing run stopping techniques, etc. But some of the data that he shared, I wanted to mention. From 2016 to 2021, defenses lined up in the nickel with at least 5 defensive backs on the field 57% of the time. From 2022 to 2024, that was up to 64%. Not a massive increase, but a significant one. And then he also mentioned that he only had a rate of 2 high defenses, plays with defenses playing with 2 deep safeties available dating back to 2019. But every year he had it from 2019 on, it has increased, and it was the highest it had ever been in 2024. He notes the main reason is the popularity of Vic Fangio's and Mike McDonald's defensive systems. These are the biggest reasons. You talk about these split safety looks, the light boxes you were discussing, the nickel defenses. Those things all tie together, right? The biggest part of that was we're taking away the deep explosive passes. We've been talking about this on Stealing Bananas for multiple years. We want more DBs on the field. We want a cover 2 sort of umbrella that we can mold. We're not always going to be in 2 safeties, but we're going to be able to shift and rotate and continue to put caps or an umbrella or whatever on the vertical routes on the what the offense is trying to do in the passing game. The trade-off of that, again, is lighter defenses overall. And even if you disagree with this idea of like less emphasis on developing run stopping techniques, but a big part of that comes out is how like the NFLPA and the last couple CBAs has been able to argue for fewer like contact practices in the off seasons and those things. If you're not doing all that in the off season and then you get into the in-season element and suddenly you have to go fit run gaps and you're all, by the way, you're smaller than the guy that you got because you're a DB and you got to come up and you have responsibilities in the run game. It's trickier. These things are not necessarily being taught, but even if you don't believe that there's less emphasis on developing the run stopping techniques, the point that I'm trying to make here with the nickel defenses and these things is those are players that are on NFL rosters not to stop the run, but to stop the pass. I mean, it's a different position You don't, and the type of linebacker that was on these rosters to stop the run back in the day, or the defensive tackles I mentioned, those really huge ones, don't really exist anymore. The defensive tackles are a lot leaner and a lot more agile these days than they were. I mentioned the Sam Adams and those guys, the helmets couldn't even fit on their heads, or like the Zach Thomas type of linebacker, right? These guys that were just run stopping linebackers. It's different. It's a different skill set now. You need to be able to guard tight ends in the pass game that are more dynamic and some of those types of things. So you have to be able to do, two-way, even to be an off-ball linebacker in the modern NFL. Anyway, that stuff is leading to a different climate. It's leading to a lot of these trends that you were just discussing, the efficiency for all of those running backs at the top. But then in this piece that I wrote, I write about all that stuff, and then I write another section said, what does it mean for fantasy? And I started that section here, Shawn, saying the key I think a ton of people are going to miss here is that rushing efficiency taking off doesn't necessarily mean it has to be early round running backs racking up the points. And this gets back to the concepts of like zero RB and the dead zone stuff that you just referenced, and why you're talking about all of the key running backs at the top. I talked about it here as well. I mean, we have a pretty good idea of who the very most talented running backs are. But to your point, once you get outside those first few rounds, you're not drafting 4-3 athletes. You don't get a Saquon Barkley in the 5th round or whatever. Even last year, we were debating whether he was worth an early 2nd round pick or more like a late 2nd or 3rd round pick, or where he belonged. Number one, to be able to exploit a lot of these things to the point you were making about the different athleticism and the different really truly talented players, you're going to want these talented players. And maybe there will be opportunities for some of those talented players to be available. But typically speaking, we know who the most talented backs are, and they are going to cost you in drafts. The point that I got to in terms of what it means for fantasy, and this isn't like a huge helpful thing, but it was that I think it increases the leverage for getting the running back position right. And then I went on to say that I'm going to try to be a lot more intentional and discerning about how I play running backs. I do want to take some of these early running backs in some situations. I do want to have exposure to them. And we've had exposure to them in the past. We're not zero RB in every single draft or anything. We've talked about that a lot. The dead zone stuff, people are going to say, well, running back scored last year. You can take running backs wherever you want. The dead zone stuff to me starts to be a concern as well, because there was still Bucky Irving and Chase Brown and Tyrone Tracy and Chuba Hubbard last year. I mean, you start to talk about
one of the main reasons that we targeted Chase Brown relentlessly is that he is a guy who, once you have moved kind of out of the dead zone and you're into the contingent play backs, where you're drafting someone with extraordinary speed, and it matters in a huge way.
And that's the stuff that can bubble up and hit, is that Bucky Irving didn't have necessarily the speed, but he had the ridiculous evasion rates. We knew that this guy could make everyone miss, and he did at the NFL level as well.
I was telling you, we just went through the light boxes. Bucky Irving had extraordinary numbers against heavy boxes, which, if anything, you're like, I mean, what he did last year was one of the more extraordinary rookie seasons that we've ever seen.
Yeah, it really was. And then the gap between him and Rashard White, who we knew was not that player, right? Was not going to be able to add a lot to what was already blocked and what was available to him. And so looking for these types of dynamic players at all the different costs, but including late. It's not, okay, now we just... So many people think, like, they start to hear all these trends about, oh, it's way more favorable for running backs now. That means I need to draft more running backs in the important rounds of fantasy football. And running backs scoring, I'm here to tell you, is probably going to be here to stay in some degree. How healthy they stay is going to be interesting going forward. You had some interesting thoughts for me prior to the show about we're probably getting a little bit better about not just injury rehab, but injury prevention. And maybe there's some elements there that are part of why running back stayed so healthy last year. Maybe a lot of the stuff that they're doing between games, off the field, in practice. And again, this goes back to Barkley, as I was sitting here telling you how many touches I already mentioned, but I'm like, Shawn, he had so many touches all the way through February. How is this guy's body going to rehab? How is he going to come back the next year? So as I mentioned, the McCaffrey point, obviously McCaffrey comes back. I would argue, I would feel as a 29-year-old who had prior, lower body injury issues, multiple seasons cut short in the prior 3 years before his huge 2023, he had a huge 2023 that went through to the Super Bowl and had over 400 total touches. I would argue the fact that he wound up having Achilles tendonitis the next August probably had a little bit to do with what happened in 2023 and how long that season went. And so Barkley is really interesting from that perspective of, is he this year's McCaffrey? Because he also has had seasons cut short in the past. The maybe slight difference is, number one, Barkley probably stayed a little bit more healthy than McCaffrey if you really want to like get into the nuance of those different things. Number two, Barkley, I mean, McCaffrey was still dynamic in the postseason as well, but Barkley was still like really imposing as well in the postseason. And I think that's an interesting point as it relates to what you were saying about maybe we've gotten better over time with the injury prevention stuff, that maybe the huge workload for Barkley was better managed. The Eagles are a very analytically forward and focused team and smart team. Maybe they were doing some things and managing things in certain ways that allowed Barkley to be at peak performance all the way through January and through to February, and will help him rehab in the offseason and those types of things. So that stuff is, to me, is really difficult to parse and to understand. I think there's obvious risk there, but we know there's risk with any running back in any situation. But yeah, I mean, how we approach this stuff in fantasy is going to be very interesting going forward. We're not talking necessarily today about all these late round running backs, but a lot of these trends that we're talking about don't necessarily mean you go all in on all the early round running backs, because the late round running backs can still take advantage of them is sort of the really other key point that I wanted to drive home. But these early backs, Shawn, I mean, you mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about Bijan, because we were talking about him a little before, and you were expressing a little bit of skepticism about maybe his explosiveness and what he will ultimately be at the NFL level, because we didn't see the long runs last year. And that was one of the things that was, I mean, when are those going to come? But even despite not really having any huge runs, I mean, his long for the full season ended up being 37 yards. He still wound up with a 4.8 yards per carry, like really close to 5. I mean, one of the ways that running backs push their way up to 5 yards per carry is they have a lot of 50, 60 plus yard runs. He didn't have those, but he was still a very efficient runner. He was at 4.6 yards per carry as a rookie. He's a consistently efficient runner, makes guys miss, does do those things. This run to daylight element that you love to talk about, you've been talking about, is sort of the concern with him, right? And I don't know. I want to let you talk about it, because I'm interested in your thoughts on it.
Bijan's profile is so good that if we got more explosive straight line play, I think he would be a slam dunk. One of the things you're almost certainly going to get this season is at least a mild step forward from the offense. It's one of the things with him, and he's drafted again as the top guy, so it's not like people aren't expecting some element of this. But if Bijan goes off and has a 25 point per game season, in hindsight, it's going to look very obvious to all of us that he played in Arthur Smith offenses. He played in this offense with Kirk Cousins as they were making the switch to a new offense. And that once you had the second season from Michael Penix, the second season of this offense that is more effective than what an Arthur Smith offense would be, that he was going to make a big jump. I think it's a very safe play. I think it's a very good play. I think if you have a pick early, you should take Bijan Robinson and not worry about it too much. I guess my concern would simply be that in those same types of environments, his overall efficiency is not as high. And the one thing that jumps out is just that the yards before contact are not nearly as good. Everything else is the same. And some of that is that run to daylight element. You can go and look at some of the other things in his profile, even to some of the next gen tracking from the collegiate level, where their production grade from Robinson is like 99, right? It's the best you can possibly do. It's one of the greatest running back profiles we've ever seen. The athleticism is still very good, but it's very good and not at the same level as Saquon Barkley, not at the same level as Jonathan Taylor. And we think, various forms of athleticism. Clearly his agility at that size is extraordinary, but he is a little bit more of a Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson type of player then he is the style of player we've been talking about with these guys that are going to break a lot of long runs. Now, again, the thing that's so good about that is that those guys actually were in that 25 point per game level that these run to daylight backs probably can't get to, because even with extraordinary efficiency, they're hitting these ceilings in the, well, I mean, we just got the 22 point per game season from Barkley, but you're almost certainly going to struggle to get over 20 with the other backs based on the other elements of their profile. Now, I think there's a very strong possibility that the moat around David Montgomery's committee portion is not as strong as people think that it is, and that we could see a jump from Jahmyr Gibbs that would make him the clear RB1. There's the possibility that Daniel Jones would win the starting job with the Colts, which would pull Jonathan Taylor certainly back into the first round, if not allow him to challenge. One of the things, Ben, we have Robinson here, we have these other guys. My question would be, is the best way to learn the Saquon Barkley lesson to actually apply it to other backs who are less expensive? We're always trying to get as much as we can for as little as possible. When you're talking about picks in the first 2 rounds, you're still having to really pay. But it does go back to this question of, if you're going to give up the only really strong receiver profiles, because then once we get past Nico Collins, who, you know, is going at 203, there, you really don't have another receiver profile that jumps out as being like, this is the guy you would have to have. There are certainly plenty of profiles where, like, this guy could contribute to your team. And I don't want to ignore the fact that we could have out of nowhere types of seasons, especially for young players in the second half of 2025. But in order to hit these running backs, we have to give up the only true difference-making wide receiver profiles. And that part, you know, is, if you end up playing a lot of leagues, then you more or less take these guys at ADP across positions. But if you're talking about the main event, if you're talking about the big gorilla with the 350 entry, you know, if you're going to play 10 of those, say, you still probably are going to make some decisions about what you think the best way to attack it is, and then what that means for the rest of your strategy. So deciding how you want to play these run to daylight backs, I mean, it's just a fascinating question, and probably the question that determines everything you do in 2025.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. I'm looking at the same ADP as you, and on FFPC with the tight end premium, it starts Jamar Chase, Bijan, Saquon, Brock Bowers. So if you're at 105, you're looking at Justin Jefferson, Jahmyr Gibbs, CeeDee Lamb, Ashton Jeanty as the next guys. I mean, you're looking at 2 really good receivers, 2 really good running backs. To your point, in the second round when it comes back, I see what you're trying to do there, where you're like, well, after Nico Collins, now we're talking about Drake London, Ladd McConkey, A.J. Brown. I don't know that I love those profiles quite as much, but I can still get Jonathan Taylor there, or Devon Achane's the RB7, a couple picks higher. There's some opportunity to basically go Jefferson, Jonathan Taylor, as opposed to, say, Gibbs, Ladd McConkey. And, you know, does that feel like a cleaner way of doing it? Having said that, when you're talking about learning the lesson of Saquon Barkley, one of the things I was thinking is, like, maybe the lesson just is that, you know, that Saquon Barkley is unique. We're looking for the outliers, right? Like the lesson that, the thing that I don't want to miss. He
averaged the same FPOE as Jahmyr Gibbs, who, I mean, on some of those Gibbs plays, especially down the stretch, but across the full, I mean, would you feel comfortable saying that, like, you would prefer Saquon Barkley to Jahmyr Gibbs if you were starting your own reality team?
No, I guess I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that. No, I mean, Gibbs is a really, really dynamic player. I mean, his receiving work alone, especially if you include week 18, which I know fantasy people debate this all the time, but they were trying to win a division, and he went out and had a 4-touchdown game and had his best fantasy game of the season. So whether or not you include that's going to make a huge difference. But if you include it in points per game, he was right there with Saquon. He was half a point behind him. That was his monster game. He scored more total points because Saquon sat in week 18. Now people are going to say, well, that wasn't even a part of the fantasy season. Again, the opponent was trying. The Vikings were trying to win that game. The Lions were trying to win that game. They were playing a really tough game. Now, to the flip side of that, you can just start talking about the postseason. because teams are obviously trying in the postseason. Barkley had a monster postseason. Gibbs did too. Gibbs in their one postseason game scored 35 points. That was his other best game of the season. So at the end of the year, and the stuff that didn't actually get into the fantasy season, Jahmyr Gibbs was right there with Saquon, if not better. I mean, he was insane. And so, yes, like that, there's no question that Jahmyr Gibbs can be right there and be that good. I don't think that's really a debate. I don't think his ADP, it's right in the middle of the first round I still love that. I think it's a good value for the reasons you're saying. He probably should be the very first running back taken. I mean, honestly, like, because I think the floor is so high and then the ceiling is that much higher if the Montgomery element changes at all because of injury to Montgomery or otherwise. You were just discussing this, but I think people talk themselves out of Gibbs's ceiling because he shares the backfield a little bit. And to me, it's just like, that just creates this asymmetrical thing where he's this good despite that. And then what if that's not there? And we've seen when it's not there, his ceiling is just blows the top off of everything. And he continues to grow into his prime while Montgomery continues to age probably out of his. And so you're talking about, is 2025 going to be the exact same as 2024 or 2023 when he was a rookie? Probably not. Probably 2025 is more Jahmyr Gibbs, especially when you consider the fact that the last two games that these guys played, Jahmyr Gibbs was their whole team to some respect. I mean, he had 80 fantasy points over those two games, week 18 plus the divisional round. So this is, not a crazy take by any means that Gibbs is that dynamic. But I do, the Barkley, the point that I was making about the Barkley thing is just reminds me of Derrick Henry, which I did for a few years. Now, the Derrick Henry thing, the point that I loved to make at that time in as it relates to, what Pat Crane went on to write about as legendary upside was this idea that you keep talking about, what the scoring level actually is. For Henry, even when he led the NFL in rushing yards and rushing TDs and all of that, his receiving was so limited that in PPR, he was about a 20-point per game guy. And it wasn't the 25-point per game monster seasons that a Christian McCaffrey can have or what have you. But Derrick, the lesson of Derrick Henry at that time was he was just sort of inevitable. He was and whether it's just Derrick Henry or it's Derrick Henry plus the Titans situation or what have you. I'm trying to find the season. It was the 2020 season. He averaged 20.9 PPR points. Both Dalvin Cook and he had over 2,000 rushing yards, 17 rush TDs, both led the league, but he only had 19 catches for 114 receiving yards. And so that was this trap profile where even though he was that good as a runner, basically maxed out, he had 378 rush attempts in 16 games. I mean, this is the whole curse of 370 thing, right? Like he had a massive number of rushes. Did seem to be a huge curse for Henry, who's still going strong, 5 years later. But both Dalvin Cook and Alvin Kamara, 24.1, 25.2 points per game, more than 3 points per game better than Henry in seasons where, Kamara scored 21 touchdowns. Cook scored 17. That was the 15-5 year, I think, for Cook. You talked about Cook was better on the ground, had 1,500 rushing yards, 44 catches, still good enough as a receiver to chip in. Kamara had an 83 catch, 750 receiving yards season. That was the huge part of his profile. But those two guys had additional stuff with their rushing enough that, it makes a huge difference in the scoring range, like the ways that these things add up. And it's important to remember it. So anyway, even Derrick Henry in his prime wasn't the greatest scorer. And that isn't an important element back to the Saquon point. And yet the lesson that I took from that Henry stretch and those periods until, the 1 year where he ends up getting injured, but then even to last year, was basically that Derrick Henry was the guy I ended up comparing him to was Jim Brown, which I didn't watch Jim Brown or anything, but if you go look at Jim Brown's stats, every single year he led the league in rushing yards per game, touchdown, something. He was the best running back in the NFL and basically unstoppable and just did it for 9 straight years and then retired. And Henry was sort of that dude in that stretch. And then even into last year, Barkley obviously ends up rushing for a little bit more yards than him, but has another one of those seasons where the two of them gap everyone else in rushing yards. He's a runner and a rusher of the football in a way that is different than every other player. He's just that dynamic of a player, and the situations maybe are part of it, but that's the other thing that I don't want to miss as a possibility with Barkley, essentially, is that what we saw in 2024 is unique to Barkley and the Eagles and what they were able to do and how they were able to win on the line of scrimmage, because that's it. Barkley's a really unique talent. We know that. We also know that the Eagles are really uniquely good at creating yards before contact. It was great for Miles Sanders. It was great, for all these other guys. And Barkley then is capable, once he gets into space. You love to. I think you maybe mentioned this before the show, so I'm gonna kind of steal it from you. I don't know if you mentioned it yet on the show, but he's basically the quintessential small back, even though in a big back's body, though. But once he gets into space, like, he's a home run hitter. He runs to daylight in a way that is Jahmyr Gibbs-esque, right? Or like a smaller back. I mean that as a compliment, obviously, not any kind of detriment to Barkley, but as a bigger back, this is a guy who can eat up yards like an undersized back that has to rely on that. Barkley shouldn't have to rely only on that. It's Derrick Henry-esque, is another guy who was able to eat up yards. I mean, in his prime, there was nobody that hit on more long touchdown runs than Derrick Henry. Saquon Barkley's ability to do that, and the pairing of that with the Eagles system that creates these yards before contact, and what can, on some of Barkley's long runs last year, if you go back and you watch the highlights, you're talking about an offensive line wiping out the first layer of the defense, and he's into the second layer, just basically running where the line is supposed to be. I mean, he's not having to even pick out a hole in some of these cases. They're so dynamic at blocking, and some of that probably is the Jalen Hurts element as well, where defenses have to be wider and they have to respect the keeper and the sweep of the quarterback sweep to the edge, but it allows the offensive line and the blocking schemes inside the line between the tackles to get the angles they need to get and to create the space that they need to create, move bodies, what have you. And then Barkley's out there 6-8 yards downfield before he's ever really touched in some of these cases. And that's when he's also so special and so dynamic, and he's going to probably house that. You're not going to stop him. And so anyway, that I want to find the next Saquon Barkley, but what if the next Saquon Barkley, what if it's just Barkley doing it again? What if what he's doing is not really replicable around the league?
Yes, I think that's true. I do think that part of our plan, though, in addition to maybe not passing up that profile, although like one of your problems you have there is Barkley harder or easier to replace than Brock Bowers? That'll be kind of a question for a different show and for the course of the summer.
For the whole offseason, yeah.
Right. But when we think about Barkley, like, how could we replicate some version of that at the different price levels, right? And so as you were talking about the whole thing, just kind of looking at this, and some of this is, again, just picking out things that we like about guys we like and maybe don't like about guys we're more skeptical of. But if you think about like how teams are going to approach the offseason and either stick to what works or change in a more positive direction on these soft-ish boxes, right? Barkley, I mentioned, was averaging 3.7 yards before contact. Josh Jacobs, who had a huge number of total carries last year and was the Packers offense through the majority of the season, was at 1.6. When you think about how that sort of manifests in big plays as well, because a lot of what we're talking about there is going to be at least somewhat driven by the big plays. If your offense, when they're playing you in such a way and say, run it, right? Run it and show us you can do it. When you do, and you create all of these big plays, then the defense either has to change or you're just like, we're fine. I mean, this is working for us. We're going to go win a Super Bowl. What the Packers did in those environments simply will not work. It will not make you dynamic enough to stick with the Lions and the Vikings. And then if the Bears take a step forward, which seems somewhat reasonable and certainly not guaranteed, but now you're looking at being the worst team in your division, even if you're one of the better teams in the NFL, the Packers have to do something different, which is one of the reasons why when we look at the Josh Jacobs price at 211, that seems fairly problematic. We're probably at that point thinking, okay, you just take a George Kittle, then you don't have to worry about the Brock Bowers kind of decision, or you can take the receivers there, or you can reach for some of these other runners. I've mentioned at times.
But we talked about the guy going right before him is Bucky Irving. We talked about that being a little bit scary at that price. As much as we love Bucky, the guy right after him is Kyron Williams, who we don't necessarily love that price on.
Can't draft.
Guy right after that's Breece Hall, who we talked about. We don't love that price on. And then Chase Brown's the only other third round running back. We did, as we talked through these guys recently, like the Brown price at least come around to the Brown price a little bit more than those other guys. But you're talking about that tier break at receiver after Nico Collins in the early second round. I'm seeing one in the second round at running back. And especially if Jonathan Taylor, as much as you're saying all this favorable stuff about him, if he starts to creep up towards the earlier part of the second round, which I kind of suspect he will, the running backs tend to start to rise a little bit later in the offseason. Taylor's a guy who had a really great end of the year, was tough for drafters for most of the year last year. So I think the early offseason stuff is a lot of vibes sometimes where people like, I took Jonathan Taylor in the second round last year. It didn't work out for me, even though he was great late. And then you get into like projection season and start to really think through some things. There's some issues with the team skill that you talked about. But I think people are going to say profile, like you want to talk about trying to find the Saquon Barkley at a cheaper price. Like it can be Jonathan Taylor, right? We know that. You just talked a little bit ago about how Jonathan Taylor basically was that a couple years ago when he had the 2,000-yard rushing season or close to it. He was that dynamic and had all the explosive runs and is that kind of player and was that player at Wisconsin. And like we have Jonathan Taylor's a really good running back sample. We know that. Dynamic prospect, all of those things that are similar to Barkley. It's not an unfair comparison to Barkley. It's a compliment to Taylor. But if that stuff gets builds and he rises, we're just going to have a clear tier break in the second round at all positions. Are we not? I'm not seeing like Kittle, that's a tight end 3 to me, is probably the best value after that point because he probably deserves to be a little higher up in my mind, closer to Bowers and McBride. Maybe tight end is the one position where there's not a massive tier break. You mentioned Kittle as a potential option in the late 2, but is there not a huge tier break at running back at that point as well?
No, I think there is. I think how you play round 3 is tricky because you really are not wanting to already make compromise picks. You're not wanting to take huge risks or simply settle for lesser players, but you're going to have to do one of the two, right? You're going to have to do something like select a Breece Hall despite the huge risk. I mean, the name that really jumps out there in round 3 where you're like, is this even remotely viable based on last year's performance and just off the field, everything? But I mean, Tyreek Hill is there in the middle of round 3. And you're almost facing that and just like, even if it's nothing, it makes more sense than simply like straightforwardly compromising. The other thing that becomes interesting is taking a Lamar Jackson.
I was just going to say that. Do you take the quarterback and then, because it's flat, we always say that. Do you just go elite quarterback? And I think that's an interesting point.
As we kind of move out of that range and sort of wrap up this conversation, I do think that Kenneth Walker at the 411 is interesting.
It's more and more interesting. That's when I was looking ahead. I was like, that's the next profile that, anyway, I'll let you comment on it.
He's so fast. And again, Kenneth Walker right now is one of the guys where you're like, how can you draft him? It just seems super risky. Once he hits, it's going to have felt inevitable. So you have to kind of balance that dynamic there. I do think that one of the concerns I would simply have is that when we're seeing these run to daylight backs explode, it is often within the context of a dynamic offense or an offense that requires the defense to account for other things. And even someone like a Devon Achane last year, once the offense wasn't able to force the defense to account, that back completely collapsed in terms of what the rushing efficiency was. Certainly the fact that the Seahawks are not a team we feel like we can count on at this point does explain most of, if maybe not all, the pricing there. Then the player that I have been consistently not just higher on, but like egregiously higher on to where I think people really question if I'm even following what's happening is Travion Henderson. Mm-hmm. You're talking about a guy who max speed in his 40 at the combine was 23.4. He had the best athleticism score according to Next Gen in this class that is athletic. And so there you have that Gibbs type of profile at a discount where you have the receiving and you have the ability to create these huge plays. RJ Harvey is probably not quite the same straight line, but again, extremely athletic. One of the reasons we like him early, he seems like he's continuing to get more expensive quickly, unfortunately. Ben, just put down on the note, don't mention RJ Harvey again.
Yeah, that he's ahead of Travion Henderson here now. But I love that pocket too that you mentioned. So to put some values on that, in the ADP we're looking at in the early 4th round, I mentioned Chase Brown was the last 3rd round player. Early 4th round, you have James Cook and Omari and Hampton. And then late 4th round, that's 402, 403. Half dozen picks go by at 409. You have Alvin Kamara, 410, Joe Mixon at RB16, RB17. Those are two that very comfortable letting sit there, especially when you think of this 3-back group behind them, which is Kenneth Walker, RB18 at 411, RJ Harvey, RB19 now at 501, Travion Henderson, RB20 at 503. That's a really nice pocket of profiles that you just talked about, all 3 of them. That's where it starts to get fun again. And so if you are in a position to take like a quarterback where you're saying, oh, it's flat here, well, then there's some profiles that you can come back with. Like, okay, well, we were able to push these profiles a little bit and add Lamar Jackson to our build and then get these guys. I think that's pretty interesting. After that, you get Chuba Hubbard. I guess I'm a little bit into Chuba Hubbard at RB21, probably more of a traditional dead zone-y profile where it's like he's the incumbent, he's a veteran. If the market's not more interested in him than this, then it's probably a good sign that the guaranteed touches are maybe not quite what they are. But I mean, he's still young and he's pretty dynamic, and that offense looked better down the stretch last year in a way that, I mean, Rico Dowdle, Trevor Etienne are going to be backing him up, but Jonathan Brooks is out for the year. I do wonder if Hubbard maybe could be an intriguing 5th round pick there. Then Judkins as the late 5th rounder. James Conner, Caleb Johnson, David Montgomery, Aaron Jones, DeAndre Swift are the 6th round backs. That I think you're clearly into. Hope you got into that Kenneth Walker, RJ Harvey, Travion Henderson group, because a round or 2 rounds later, if you're talking about taking those guys, I think you're feeling a little bit like a pretty significant tier drop has just happened. And maybe that's the more classic dead zone, at least as far as I'm seeing it.
I completely agree. And one of the things, this is sort of our 3rd straight show where we've had a pretty meaningful emphasis on the running back position and how you would play it. We want to make sure we're working through the different angles so we understand for ourselves how we want to play running back in 2025. We want to make sure that we're not getting down a one single path in terms of how we are thinking about the position. I do want to mention as we continue to kind of work through the ADP here that I don't think it has to be exclusively one thing or exclusively another. What you're looking for are the types of profiles that allow you to crush price. And it doesn't have to simply be this one that we're talking about. The other profiles that crush price are still there, right? The Bijan Robinson, you asked me about, that profile is still there. That can crush price. The person who, as we get into this next group, that is the most interesting to me, and certainly is not a run to daylight back, is Cam Skattebo. And the thing with him is that is your Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson type of profile, where you've got a big back. You're probably not going to get the big plays, but you're going to get the benefits of having a big back, and you're going to get the receiving. Now, we don't know that that's how the Giants are going to play it. Certainly, Tyrone Tracy is still there. Tyrone Tracy is very athletic. He's someone who can be used in a wide variety of circumstances. Skattebo may not be that guy as a rookie, but I just want to emphasize, like, not everybody that we draft has to have, mid 4.3 speed. But even though we talked about him a lot, I just want to note that this is the other reason that when we spent basically 2 shows talking about Jaden Blue, that's one of the main reasons why. That borderline 4.2 speed for him, when you look at his pro day, when you look at Brashard Smith, probably the fastest straight line guy in this draft, when you look at Bashal Tutin, maybe the most athletic guy. I mean, he and Henderson are kind of in the mix there to be the guy. You think about those offenses, Dallas, Kansas City, Jacksonville, if they take this jump with the new coach and with Travis Hunter and all those types of things, that gets us a little bit closer to this dynamic where you have the offense in place that forces the defense to account, and then you have the guys who can really run. Then what do you think that Chris Johnson and Jamal Charles would do against this current iteration of NFL defenses?
You put them against these guys that can't stop the run and against some of these offensive lines that can create the holes and move the bodies and give them space to run to daylight. I mean, they might run for 2,500. Maybe they might run for 3,000 yards. I mean, and that's not to knock Saquon Barkley, but I mean, those guys were hitting home runs every week in a different NFL, man. Those guys were fun to watch weekly. Yeah, I was just trying to think through that. Like it's a different world in the modern NFL. And as you were talking through the speed stuff, and I was kind of trying to think, I mean, the guys that can really take advantage of that, I don't know enough about it, but if there was a way that I could really know a lot about run blocking and run design and run scheme, it's probably a worthwhile thing to consider, right? I mean, it's not to take away from Saquon Barkley, but it was not a small element to what he was able to do, that he got into space without really having to do anything on several plays. Then his talent can take over. Again, that's not saying that he didn't do anything for the entirety of the play or anything to that effect. And you've talked for a long time about how yards before contact is a running back stat as well. Eating up those yards matters, and his ability to then eat those yards up when they're there is relevant. His acceleration and his explosiveness, and look, I'm going to run to daylight is what you're talking about. But these guys, especially some of the ones that are not Saquon Barkley, when you start talking about like Brashard Smith and stuff, I'm like, man, are the Chiefs going to be able to block well enough to get him into space? Because if they do, then you're done. You talk about Bashal Tutin, are the Jags going to be able to do that well enough to get him into space? I've been really excited about him in part because of how good the Bucks backs were last year. Liam Cohen, I thought, did a really good job of getting him into space. There's two elements to that. You talked about how Bucky Irving was making guys miss with 8 men in the box, and he was creating the space more than maybe any other back in the NFL, possibly. He was not the most dynamic back from an explosiveness standpoint, but from an evasive standpoint, maybe. Maybe he was the most dynamic. The other side of that is Rachaad White. I felt like all year defenses were trying. They had him on their fantasy team. Like he'd catch a swing pass and nobody would be 10 yards around him, and he'd just run up the sideline for a 15-yard touchdown, receiving TD, where it was like, this guy's not even moving that fast, but there's no defender that wants to get near him. And maybe that was play design with the routes downfield and some of that stuff that Cohen can create for guys like Bashal Tutin. We'll see, I guess. But I do think if I could have a strong understanding of which of these offenses have the best offensive lines for run blocking. And a lot of that, look, there's a lot of people out there that do great offensive line research. A lot of that comes to stuff that when you read about offensive line, stuff that's hard to quantify. It's about cohesiveness. It's about the way that they gel even throughout the season, from the early part of the season to the late part. The stuff that makes the Eagles so dynamic and so good as an offensive line, probably tougher to quantify, or else other teams would be able to do it. It has been a priority for several teams this offseason, though. You get the copycat league element. The Eagles win the Super Bowl last year in the trenches, and everyone knows it. And we talked about it on an earlier show, but the Bears and the Vikings, two NFC North teams, went out and made acquisitions to get multiple interior offensive linemen via either trade or free agency, as well as interior defensive linemen. And it was like, these teams want to bulk up and be able to move bodies around in the offense and stop their defensive line from being moved around on the defensive line. I think defensive tackles are going to be pretty relevant as well as far as run defense goes, just being able to hold the ground in the modern NFL. Anyway, those types of things are probably something that I want to make sure I'm doing my research into. I haven't done it now, and I can't share with the listeners a bunch of fun takeaways, but man, when you start to talk about how those backs that can run to daylight can be so dynamic in this landscape, and what would Chris Johnson do? What would Jamal Charles do? I'm also thinking, which of the ones that are here that you just named that are here in the league now are going to get some help getting into space, because that can be so crucial to them then racking up massive numbers of yards.
And as I say this next thing, I certainly don't want to put it all on the back, because the offenses in many cases are created very, very differently. But we think about some of those rookies who were just drafted. We think about Travion Henderson. Ramondre Stevenson was at 1.4 yards before contact in this situation with 7 or fewer box defenders. Tank Bigsby was at 1. And 105 carries in that situation, averaged 1 yard before contact. It was interesting too, because as I was writing up the big gorilla article, which should come out at some point.
You've been teasing that for a couple weeks.
It's long, Ben. It became.
I'm excited.
It became a bigger gorilla than I was expecting.
It's the biggest gorilla. Look, it's stealing bananas, Shawn. You got to get the biggest gorilla.
It was pretty striking, the game that you talked about last week, how Tank Bigsby's entire season really just was that game. And probably the Jaguars understand that. So, yeah, this has been a fun conversation, Ben. We've answered, I think, the question of whether or not you should draft Saquon Barkley. You should. Maybe. You're staring right there at Brock Bowers. But definitely draft some of these guys who can absolutely fly. And if nothing else, this was a great way to start some of the discussions on how we want to think about the early rounds. Then we talk some about building from back to front, but certainly in actual drafts, you've got to make those early picks first. You do need to know who your priority targets late are, but those first 18 picks or so are fascinating. I do like the fact that in 2025, you have a little bit of this tilt toward drafters who don't get the top spots. Certainly, if you were playing a third round reversal league, I think you would want a late pick in 2025, or at least there'd be the potential for that to really help you. The fact that if you're going to get Jamar Chase, who seems like, far and away the most important player, and or if you're going to get Brock Bowers, that you have to sacrifice in terms of what does appear to be that mid-second round tier break. I like that. We want these drafts to be as balanced as possible.
The years where the second round has a significant tier break are easily the best years, right? The best puzzles and those things. Last year was one where it wasn't really like that. It felt like the early second to the late second was and then into the third was very flat. And so you get an advantage in the first round, and then also you get an advantage in the third round, but you're not really sacrificing an advantage in the second round in non-third round reversal leagues. That felt like, oh yeah, the early picks are definitely at a huge advantage here. The 2-3, they get a double tap this other tier that the guys at the back half of the first round are, at 112, you might be in that tier with both of your first 2 picks, and they're still in that tier at 212 and 301. Plus they got the 101, which, if it was McCaffrey, didn't really pan out, but it felt like a huge disconnect between these different spots. I love that. That's a great point. I love that about this year and about the years that play out this way, where if you get a back half spot, you're like, well, I get 2 players that are better than your first 2 players. You can at least tell yourself that, right?
Yeah, and especially, as you mentioned, it's not just those first 2, but round 3, round 5, to have that early pick in those rounds. Sometimes you're even round 7. That's one of the things we ran into last year a lot, was round 7. If you have a late pick in round 7, what do you do? Now, you got to pick someone who becomes a breakout player, and thankfully that's been something we've been relatively successful with. And I was just thinking about, some of those years you have Jamar Chase threaten the holdout coming off of less impressive performances. And one of the greatest seasons in recent memory goes almost at the 1-2 turn. So we'll see if we get a performance like that out of that area this year. There are guys who are very compelling, including the player with the highest ceiling in all of fantasy is going in the second round. So there are some possibilities there. Ben, that'll do it for today's episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow him with Stealing Signals, bengretch.substack.com. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz, coupon code RVRadio 2025 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year subscription. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.